I'm Madeline Kaiser, and I'll be reading The Elves and the Shoemaker. There was a time when everyone believed in elves. The shoemaker and his wife in this story certainly did. The shoemaker worked hard from morn to night. The shoes he made were of the finest leather, and he was good with his hands, but business was slow. One night, he found he had only enough leather left for one pair of shoes. With a heavy heart, he cut the leather and left the pieces ready to sew the next morning. He blew out the candle and crossed the yard from his little shop into the house. "Wife, I do not know what we shall do. I have just cut out the very last piece of leather in the shop," he said sadly. "Don't be too gloomy, husband," said his wife with a tired smile. "Perhaps you will be able to sell this last pair of shoes for a fine price. Wait and see what tomorrow brings." The next day, the shoemaker was up and early as usual. When he pulled back the shutters in the shop, you can imagine his surprise when he saw not pieces of leather ready to sew on the bench, but a fine pair of ladies' shoes with delicate pointed toes. The stitching was so fine you would think it had been done by mice. He put the shoes in the window of the shop, and before long a merchant came in and bought the shoes for his new wife, paying the poor shoemaker double the usual price. The shoemaker was delighted at this turn in his fortunes, and bought enough leather to make 2 new pairs of shoes. Once again, he cut the leather carefully and left the pieces ready on his workbench to sew the next morning. The next day, the shoemaker was up even earlier than usual. His wife came in with him as he went into the shop and pulled back the shutters. "Oh, husband," she gasped, for there on the bench stood 2 pairs of the finest shoes she had ever seen. He put the shoes in the window, and very quickly in came a poet who bought one of the pairs. And not far behind him there was a person who bought the shiny black pair. And both paid him a great deal of money for the splendid shoes, with stitching so fine you'd think it had been done by mice. This continued for many days. The shoemaker would buy new leather and leave the pieces cut ready on his bench at night. And when he came back in the morning, there was the most exquisite shoes. The shoemaker's reputation spread, and his shop was soon full of customers, anxious to buy his special shoes. Before long, the shoemaker and his wife were no longer poor, but they still lived simply, as they had little wish for the luxuries of life. It was enough to be happy and healthy. One day, the wife said, "Husband, I think we must see who it is who has given us this great fortune, so we may thank them." The shoemaker agreed. So that night, after laying out the cut pieces of leather and blowing out the candle, he and his wife hid behind the door of the shop. As the town hall clock struck midnight, they heard a scampering of tiny feet and little voices laughing. 2 tiny elves slid out from behind the skirting board and climbed up onto the bench, where they were soon hard at work, stitching away with tiny stitches. They were so fine you thought they'd been done by mice. The elves sang as they stitched, sitting cross-legged on the bench. But oh, they looked poor. Their trousers were ragged, their shirts were threadbare, and their poor feet looked frozen, as they had neither socks nor shoes. In the twinkling of an eye and all the leather used up, there on the bench stood many pairs of shoes. The elves slipped away, laughing as they went. The shoemaker and his wife looked at each other, and then and there both decided to reward the little craftsman. The next day, the shoemaker took some scraps of green and yellow leather, and with the tiniest stitches possible, he made 2 little pairs of boots, yellow with green heels. The wife took her sewing basket and some scraps of cloth, and, with the tiniest stitches possible, made 2 little pairs of red velvet trousers and 2 smart green jackets with tiny silver buttons. Then she knitted 2 little pairs of yellow socks, with the tiniest stitches possible. That night, the shoemaker did not cut out any leather. Instead, he laid out the clothes and the boots with the socks, and once again he and his wife hid behind the door of the shop. As the town hall clock struck midnight, they heard a scampering of tiny feet and little voices laughing. The 2 tiny elves slid out from behind their skirting board and climbed up onto the bench. When they saw the gifts, they clapped their hands in delight, and laughing merrily, flung off their old rags and tried on their new clothes and the boots. They looked splendid. Still laughing and smiling, they slipped away behind the skirting board, and the shoemaker and his wife never saw them again. But once a year, when the shoemaker opened up the shop in the morning, on his bench he would find a special pair of shoes with stitching so fine you would think it had been done by mice. The end.